Do you think the old relic even gets what the hell we're saying?" Alistair didn't bother to whisper. His voice, slick with bourbon and entitlement, cut across the table like a shard of glass. His lieutenant, Julian, let out a sharp, predatory chuckle. "Probably not. But who gives a damn? A $2 billion deal for a silent geisha who just nods and smiles. I'd make that trade every single day of the week." That's how it started. In a place built on illusions. A private dining room suspended 50 stories above the neon-drenched chaos of Miami. A glass box they called the Apex. It was a room designed to make gods feel at home, with a view that stretched from the glittering towers of Brickell to the inky blackness of the Atlantic. What was supposed to be the birth of a legendary tech merger, a handshake worth billions, quickly curdled into something else entirely. It became a war fought in the spaces between words, in the cold assessment of a glance, in the crushing weight of prejudice. At the head of that vast marble table sat Kenna Tanaka, the woman they called the Ghost of Ginza, a titan of the tech world who had clawed her way up from nothing to build an artificial intelligence empire that was rewriting the future of medicine. But tonight, she was silent. Her silence wasn't a void. It was a fortress. She chose not to speak English. Not because she was incapable, but because she refused to. It was her shield, her scalpel, her test. And moving through the shadows of this opulent battlefield was Imani Williams. Young, black, with a quiet grace that made her almost invisible. To the men at the table, she was just a waitress, a pair of hands to refill their ridiculously expensive wine. But they were wrong. She wasn't just serving. She was absorbing. Every sneer, every dismissive flick of the wrist, every casual slur they thought was swallowed by the ambient jazz. But Imani heard it all. The crude jokes, the way they called Kenna an exotic prize, a relic to be acquired and shelved. They saw a quiet, elderly Japanese woman, an obstacle, a signature on a dotted line. They had no idea they were in the presence of a queen, and they were about to be undone by the one person in the room they never even saw. What transpired in that room wasn't just a negotiation falling apart. It was a demolition, a quiet revolution served up on a silver platter. Now, this is not just some story about rich men behaving badly. This is a story about the unseen, a story about the profound power wielded by those the world chooses to ignore. It's for every woman who has been talked over, for every person of color who has been underestimated, for anyone who has ever used their silence as a shield. When Imani finally decided to speak, she didn't just translate a few words. She detonated the entire room. So, before we pull the pin on what really happened that night, the lies, the greed, the breathtaking act of defiance, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We drop stories like this one every single week. Stories that pull back the curtain on the world you think you know. Because the person you dismiss today might just be the one who owns your world tomorrow. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this. The restaurant was more of a monument than a place to eat. The Apex sat atop the new Centurion Tower in Miami, a needle of steel and ambition that pierced the humid Florida sky. To get there, you needed a reservation made months in advance and a net worth that could withstand the shock of the bill. The elevator ride alone was an experience, a silent, stomach-dropping ascent in a glass capsule that made the city look like a scattered handful of jewels. Inside the private suite, the air was thick with the scent of money, old leather, expensive perfume, and the faint, sweet aroma of seared scallops with truffle foam. A single, massive chandelier, a galaxy of hand-blown crystal, hung over a table carved from a single slab of obsidian. The panoramic windows were the only art on the walls, displaying a 360-degree spectacle of a city high on its own success. At one end of this obsidian stage sat Alistair Vance, the CEO of Omnicore Dynamics. He was a man sculpted from privilege. Tall, with a mane of silver hair that looked meticulously unkempt, and the kind of deep, year-round tan that only comes from yacht decks and private golf courses. He wore a Brioni suit so perfectly tailored it looked less like clothing, and more like a second skin. He spoke with the easy, booming confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. To his right was Julian Croft, the CFO, the attack dog. Younger, leaner, with a nervous energy that vibrated under his designer suit. He wore a watch that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and a smirk that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. If Alistair was the king, Julian was the jackal, snapping at the heels of anyone who stood in the way of the next acquisition. They were the poster boys of corporate colonialism, sharks who saw the world as a series of territories to be conquered. And across from them sat their intended conquest, Kenna Tanaka, founder and visionary CEO of Kenshin Robotics, the Tokyo-based behemoth that had perfected neuro-integrated prosthetics and surgical AI. To them, she was a puzzle to be solved, a final piece in their global domination puzzle. But tonight, she was an enigma wrapped in silence. She was 65, but possessed a stillness that made her seem ageless. Her hair was a stark, elegant white, pulled back in a simple knot. She wore a traditional kimono of deep indigo silk, a stark contrast to the sharp, modern lines of the room. She wore no jewelry, no makeup. Her power wasn't an accessory. It was her presence. She offered no words, only the occasional, almost imperceptible nod as her aide, a nondescript man in a simple gray suit, provided whispered, clipped translations. Her silence was a vacuum, and it was making Alistair and Julian visibly agitated. And then there was Imani, 26 years old, moving with a dancer's poise, her steps silent on the polished marble. Her uniform was crisp, her expression neutral. Her name wasn't on the multi-billion-dollar contract. Her voice was not meant to be part of the conversation. But her mind was. She saw the condescending pat Alistair gave the aide's shoulder. She saw Julian's impatient finger tapping on his phone screen under the table. And she saw Kenna Tanaka, a pillar of stoicism, holding her ground in a fortress built to intimidate her, to make her feel foreign and small. The battle had already begun. The room glittered with opulence, but beneath the surface, a cold, ugly war was brewing. This was never a negotiation. It was an ambush. And none of them, not the sharks, not the queen, not the aide, knew that the most dangerous person in the room was the one pouring the water. Not yet. The first toast was a masterclass in arrogance. Alistair raised his crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 with a theatrical flourish. "To the future?" he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "A future where Kenshin's brilliant innovation meets Omnicore's global power, a true meeting of East and West." He smiled a brilliant, predatory smile, as if he'd just coined a phrase destined for the history books. Kenna Tanaka merely inclined her head, a gesture of infinitesimal grace. She lifted her small porcelain cup of sake, took a silent sip, and set it down. No words, no translation from her aide. Julian leaned toward Alistair, his whisper a venomous hiss. "What the hell was that? Is she agreeing or just being polite? I can't read this." He made no real effort to conceal his contempt. Kenna murmured something in Japanese to her aide. The man turned his impassive face to the two Americans. "Madame Tanaka appreciates your vision for the future." That was it. That was the rhythm of the entire excruciating evening. Alistair would launch into grand, sweeping monologues about market synergy, supply chain integration, and shareholder value. He painted a picture of a world where their combined companies would be unstoppable, gesturing with his hands as if he were a conductor commanding an orchestra only he could hear. After each soliloquy, Kenna would respond with a short, quiet phrase in Japanese. The aide would then translate it into a single, sterile, non-committal sentence. Julian's veneer of civility began to crack first. His legs started bouncing under the table, a frantic, jittery rhythm of impatience. He leaned in again. "Are you kidding me, Alistair? We're negotiating with a goddamn wall. This is a waste of time." Alistair's smile tightened, but he kept his voice low. "It's a tactic, Julian. A cultural thing. The whole inscrutable elder routine. Just play the game." But Julian was done playing. He snapped his fingers in Imani's direction without even gracing her with a glance. "Hey, you, more of this," he said, shaking his empty wine glass. Imani felt the snap in her bones. It wasn't a request. It was a command to an inferior. The way he said, "you," made it feel like an insult. She refilled his glass, her hands a miracle of steadiness. But her gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long on Kenna Tanaka's face. Later, as the aide translated another one of Kenna's placid, one-sentence responses, Julian rolled his eyes so dramatically it was almost a performance. "You know," he announced to the room, "for $2 billion, you'd think we could at least get an interactive experience. We could have just sent a robot to negotiate with her." Alistair chuckled, a deep, ugly sound. Imani saw it then. A flicker. In Kenna Tanaka's eyes, still calm, still unreadable to the men, but not to her. Imani saw the wound land, the barb sink in, and the monumental effort it took to conceal the sting. They weren't negotiating with her. They were performing for each other, speaking over her, around her, as if she were a piece of furniture. They saw her language not as a part of her identity, but as a defect, a problem to be managed. To Alistair and Julian, Kenna Tanaka was a variable in an equation, a name on an acquisition form. To Imani, watching from the shadows, she looked like something else, a mirror reflecting 1,000 slights she herself had endured. She could feel the pressure in the room building, the temperature dropping. The polite facade wasn't just cracking. It was about to shatter. Imani Williams had perfected the art of being invisible. It was a skill learned not in a classroom, but in the real world, through a lifetime of subtle cuts and quiet dismissals. She learned it in gifted programs where she was the only black face, in high-end boutiques where the sales staff's eyes followed her not with offers of help, but with suspicion. She learned it in the quiet, painful silence after job interviews, where they praised her resume but never called her back. Here at the Apex, invisibility was part of the job description. The training was explicit, seamless, silent, unobtrusive. Anticipate needs without being asked. Be a ghost who pours wine. Make the titans of industry feel like the center of the universe without ever acknowledging your own existence. But Imani hadn't always lived in the margins. There was a time before this, a world of vibrant color and sound. Okinawa, Japan. Her father was an Air Force linguist, a specialist in signals intelligence. Her mother, a teacher on the military base. Imani had spent the first 12 years of her life there, breathing in the salt air, exploring ancient castle ruins, and learning to navigate the intricate tapestry of Japanese culture. She wasn't an outsider. She was a part of the local school, the neighborhood festivals. She learned Japanese not from a textbook, but on the playground, in the market, at the dinner table with her friends' families. She learned the language of respect, the subtle shifts in tone, the importance of a bow, the weight of honor, before she ever learned the American language of irony and impatience. That world had shaped her. Then came the sudden transfer back to the States, to a suburb outside Atlanta. And with it, a brutal awakening. She learned that her fluency in Japanese was treated as a curious party trick, not an intellectual asset. She learned that her stories of Okinawa were met with blank stares. She learned that the world had already decided who she was, based on the color of her skin, and it was a box far too small to contain the person she knew herself to be. Now, at 26, she was a prisoner of circumstance, juggling two soul-crushing service jobs to pay down the mountain of student debt from a degree in international relations that had so far led nowhere. She worked nights, studied on the bus, and dreamed of a life where her mind was valued more than her ability to carry a tray. But tonight, watching Kena Tanaka endure this barrage of veiled contempt, something dormant inside Imani began to stir. She didn't just see a powerful billionaire being disrespected. She saw a fellow soldier in a war that was fought every day in boardrooms, classrooms, and restaurants just like this one. A war against erasure. Kena had money, power, and influence, yet in this room, she was being reduced to a caricature by men who couldn't be bothered to see the person behind the problem. Imani knew that kind of silence. She had worn it as a defense mechanism for years, but tonight, listening to the casual cruelty, she could feel her own armor beginning to fail. The pretense of negotiation had all but evaporated. Alistair leaned back, drumming his fingers on the obsidian tabletop, the rhythm a clear signal of his waning patience. Kena Tanaka remained a portrait of composure, answering each of Alistair's increasingly pointed questions with the same quiet, measured responses, delivered through her aide. Her silence was a rock, and the waves of their arrogance were breaking against it, again and again. Finally, Julian couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his linen napkin onto the table with a sigh of theatrical frustration and leaned forward, his knuckles white. "Look, we want to buy your company," he said, his voice slow and loud, enunciating each word as if speaking to a child or a dog. "Buy, company, do you understand?" Alistair let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Maybe we need to draw her a picture, Jules," he added, his voice dripping with a thick, syrupy condescension that made Imani's stomach clench. She was standing by the service credenza, her back to them, pretending to polish a wine glass, but every word was a physical blow. Her fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, the delicate crystal threatening to shatter in her grip. It wasn't just the mockery. It was the profound disrespect, the baked-in assumption that a different language meant a deficient intellect. Kena Tanaka blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. She offered no other reaction, no flicker of anger. But the temperature in the room plunged another 10 degrees. Julian smirked, emboldened by her lack of response. "I mean, is this for real? Are we closing a multi-billion-dollar deal or playing a game of charades?" And then, the final, fatal insult. A comment not meant for the room, but a muttered aside to Alistair, a conspiratorial whisper he never imagined anyone else would hear or understand. "Christ, man," he grumbled, shaking his head. "This is like trying to negotiate with a goddamn porcelain doll. Just sits there, looks pretty, and is probably hollow inside." Alistair chuckled again, adding his own flourish of cruelty. Silent, fragile, and probably costs a fortune to maintain. Imani turned around, her movements slow, deliberate. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but it wasn't the beat of fear. It was a war drum, a call to arms. She looked at Kena, whose expression was still a mask of serene neutrality. But Imani saw it, the tightening of her jaw, the almost microscopic flinch in the muscles around her eyes. She saw the storm gathering behind the mask. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. It was Marcus, her manager, a cold, ambitious man who prized protocol above all else. "Don't even think about it," he whispered, his voice a low threat. You exist to pour wine. You speak when they ask you a question about the menu. That's it. Do your job." She nodded numbly, the weight of his warning pressing down on her. But it was too late. Something inside her had already snapped. Kenna spoke then, a single phrase in Japanese, not to her aide, not to the men, but to the empty space in front of her. It was so quiet, Imani almost missed it. "Watashi no sonzai ni, dareka kidzuite kurenai no daruka?" Imani heard it with perfect, devastating clarity. Is there no one here who even sees that I exist? And in that instant, Imani Williams knew. This wasn't just ignorance. It wasn't a cultural misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of erasure, and she was no longer willing to be a silent witness. The room was suspended in that strange, taut silence that follows a moment of profound disrespect. Julian was leaning back in his chair, a smug look of satisfaction on his face after his porcelain doll comment. Alistair was swirling the last of his bourbon, the picture of a man who believed the game was already won. The aide sat motionless, a study in professional restraint. And Kenna Tanaka, she hadn't moved. But then she spoke again, softly. Another single sentence, launched into the void between them like a message in a bottle cast into a hostile sea. She wasn't expecting a reply. She was simply bearing witness to her own isolation. Imani heard every perfectly articulated syllable. "Watashi no honto no shugata o mite kureru hito wa koko ni inai no deshoka?" Is there truly no one here who can see me for who I am? The words didn't just enter Imani's ears, they resonated deep within her soul, a painful chord of shared experience. It wasn't just the question itself, but the profound loneliness behind it. This wasn't the lament of a weak woman. It was the quiet grief of a powerful one being rendered invisible. Imani pushed herself away from the wall. For a terrifying second, her entire body trembled. She could feel the iron grip of the employee handbook, the years of training to be silent, to be accommodating. She could feel the heat of her manager's warning on her shoulder. But that one whispered sentence from Kenna Tanaka made every rule, every protocol, every fear feel utterly insignificant. She walked toward the table. The soft taps of her sensible work shoes on the marble floor sounded like gunshots in the sudden, absolute silence. Alistair looked up, his expression one of pure annoyance. Julian scowled, confused. Her manager, Marcus, watching from the doorway, froze, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. Imani didn't hesitate. She walked directly to Kenna Tanaka's side, and then she did something that defied all logic, all training. She bowed. It wasn't the quick, perfunctory nod of a service worker. It was a deep, formal 90-degree bow from the waist, a bow of profound respect, the kind of bow one offers to a master, an elder, a person whose very presence commands reverence. When she slowly straightened up, she looked Kenna Tanaka directly in the eye, and in crisp, flawless, respectful Japanese, she spoke. "Tanaka-sama, makoto ni moshiwake gozaimasen. Watashi no yona mono ga hanashikakeru beki de wa nai koto wa juju shochite orimasu. Shikashi, kono yona burei omae ni chinmoku o mamoru koto wa, sore jitai ga uragiri to narimasu. Moshi o yurushi itadakereba, watashi ga o tetsudai itashimasu." Madame Tanaka, I am profoundly sorry. I am fully aware that it is not my place to speak, but to remain silent in the face of such disrespect is its own form of betrayal. If you will permit me, I can help. Alistair's jaw literally dropped. The bourbon glass slipped from his fingers and hit the table with a heavy, dull clunk. Julian's mouth hung open, a perfect O of stupefaction. The aide's professional mask finally cracked, his eyes wide with astonishment. But Kenna Tanaka's eyes, they widened not with shock, but with something else entirely. Recognition. It was the look of a drowning person who has just seen the light of a rescue boat cut through the storm. She reached out a delicate, steady hand and rested it on Imani's arm. Her touch was light, but it grounded Imani in the moment, and she whispered back in Japanese, her voice filled with a quiet, powerful emotion. Watashi o maite kurete. Arigato. Thank you for seeing me. And with those 5 words, the entire axis of power in that 50-story glass box tilted. Imani hadn't just spoken out of turn, she had completely rewritten the rules of the game. Kena Tanaka settled back into her chair, a new kind of calm enveloping her. Her gaze, sharp and assessing, remained fixed on Imani. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was more than permission. It was an anointment. Imani straightened to her full height. Her voice, when she spoke again, was no longer the quiet, deferential tone of a waitress. It was clear, steady, and resonant, filling the cavernous room with an authority that stunned everyone into silence. Madame Tanaka has requested that I continue as her translator for the remainder of this meeting, she announced, her words aimed directly at Alistair and Julian. She feels it is imperative that you finally comprehend the complete and total weight of her words. Julian managed a nervous, sputtering laugh. What? Her? Sure. Whatever. Let's get this over with. Imani turned back to Kena. They exchanged a few brief sentences in Japanese, a rapid, fluid exchange that was a world away from the stilted conversation that had preceded it. It was a conversation between equals. Then, Imani faced the 2 men again, her posture radiating a confidence that was utterly transformative. She would like to begin with the revised acquisition contract you presented this evening. Alistair, recovering slightly, reached into his gleaming leather briefcase and slid the heavy, bound document across the obsidian table toward her. It's all in there, he said, his voice tight. Generous, more than fair. Imani opened the folder. She scanned the first page, then the second. Her mind, sharp and analytical from years of studying complex international treaties, moved swiftly through the dense legalese. Her heart was beating fast now, not with anxiety, but with the thrill of the hunt. She wasn't a corporate lawyer, but she knew the language of deception. She recognized the scent of a trap. She flipped to a section deep within the document. Section 9, subsection C, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. This clause grants Omnicore absolute and irrevocable discretion over all of Kenshin Robotics' existing and future intellectual property patents, effective immediately upon signing. She looked up, her eyes locking with Alistair's. This isn't a merger clause. This is a license to strip mine her life's work, the surgical AI she personally coded, the neural interface patents. You could sell them off piece by piece to the highest bidder the day after the deal closes, and she would have no legal recourse. Alistair blanched. That's just standard boilerplate language for risk mitigation. Imani didn't even blink. No, she said, her voice flat and cold. Standard language protects both parties. This language is designed to gut one of them. She flipped another 20 pages. And here, Section 14, the non-compete agreement. Her tone grew sharper, colder. This is written so broadly, it would do more than just prevent Madame Tanaka from founding another robotics company. It would legally bar her from consulting, from guest lecturing at a university, even from publishing her memoirs for a period of 15 years. She lifted her gaze from the page and looked directly at them, her eyes burning with contempt. You aren't trying to acquire her company. You are trying to acquire her, lock her in a cage, and erase her from the very industry she helped create. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and damning. Alistair's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. Julian stared at the contract as if it were a venomous snake. Their bravado, their smug certainty, had evaporated, leaving behind the sour stench of exposed deceit. And Kanatanaka? She hadn't uttered a single word in English, but a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of a grandmaster watching a novice walk directly into a perfectly laid trap. Imani hadn't just read the contract. She had exposed their souls. The ambush was over. The checkmate was on the board. The air in the room was so still, Imani could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart. Alistair's tan couldn't hide the pale, sickened pallor that had crept over his face. Julian was fiddling with his pen, clicking it open and shut, the sound a tiny, pathetic punctuation mark in the crushing silence. There was nowhere for them to run, nowhere to hide. The 4 glass walls of the room had become their cage. Imani closed the leather-bound contract with a soft, final thud. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Her eyes, cold and unflinching, stayed locked on the 2 men. And then Kanatanaka spoke. This time, her voice, though still soft, had the clear, ringing quality of a temple bell. She uttered a single, sharp command in Japanese to her aide. The aide, his face now a mask of grim satisfaction, nodded once. From the inner pocket of his suit jacket, he produced a slim, silver recording device, no larger than a credit card holder. He placed it carefully on the obsidian table, its metallic gleam a stark contrast to the dark stone. He pressed a small, almost invisible button. At first there was only a faint hiss of static. Then a voice filled the room. Alistair's voice, sharp, arrogant, and utterly unmistakable. "Just get this done. Forget the performance bonuses for her senior staff. We'll absorb her top engineers with signing bonuses and gut the rest of the executive team in the first quarter. She'll be so lost in the paperwork she'll never see it coming." Julian's grating laugh followed, dripping with malice. "She's living in another century, Al. We could tell her we're making her empress of the new company and she'd probably just nod and smile. Her own translator is on our payroll, for Christ's sake. He'll feed her whatever script we write." The audio was pristine, a high-fidelity recording of their own damnation, echoing off the glass walls of their prison. Imani didn't need to translate. The meaning was brutally, unequivocally clear. But she did anyway. Her voice was level, her tone journalistic, as if she were reading a casualty report. "They assumed her silence was ignorance," Imani stated, her words dropping like stones into a deep well. "They conspired to defraud her senior staff. They bragged about having her own aide in their pocket to manipulate the terms of the deal. They planned, in meticulous detail, to dismantle her legacy while she sat at this very table, counting on the fact that she wouldn't understand." Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. "That's illegal! You can't record a private conversation without consent!" Imani turned her head slowly to face him, her expression one of utter disdain. "So is conspiracy to commit corporate fraud." Alistair remained frozen in his chair, the blood having completely drained from his face. He finally looked at Kanatanaka. Truly looked at her, for the very first time that night. He didn't see a porcelain doll. He didn't see a silent relic. He saw a fortress, bristling with cannons, and he was staring right down the barrel. Kanatanaka did not grant him the satisfaction of a smile. She didn't need one. The silver device on the table clicked off, the sudden silence more damning than any accusation. It wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was the silence of a verdict being rendered. Imani folded her hands neatly in front of her, her voice dropping to a low, powerful register. "You made 2 mistakes tonight. You underestimated the woman who built an empire from nothing, and you forgot to look at the woman who was pouring your wine. This was no longer business. This was a reckoning, and the battle was already over. The door to the private suite flew open with such force it slammed against the interior wall, the sound cracking through the tense atmosphere like a gunshot. Imani spun around just in time to see her manager, Marcus, storming into the room. His face was a mottled mask of crimson and white, his usual cold composure shattered into 1,000 pieces of pure fury. "What in the absolute hell do you think you're doing?" he seethed, his voice a low, vicious snarl. He strode past Alistair and Julian as if they were invisible, his entire focus a laser beam of rage aimed at Imani. "You abandoned your post. You interfered in a private client meeting. You spoke to a guest without being spoken to." Imani stood her ground. She didn't speak. She didn't tremble. She simply met his gaze. "You're done," he spat, his words like venom. "You are finished. I don't give a damn what your excuse is. You're fired. Get your things." From the table, Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. "About time someone in this god-forsaken place did their job." Imani clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The injustice of it was a physical fire in her chest. She had exposed a multi-billion-dollar fraud, defended a woman from being cheated and humiliated, and this was her prize. Unemployment. "Security will see you out," Marcus said, his voice dripping with finality. Imani opened her mouth to respond, to fight, to say something, though she wasn't sure what. But the words never came. Another voice, calm and impossibly deep, cut through the tension. "Actually, she won't be going anywhere." Every head in the room turned toward the open doorway. Standing there was a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall, black, and dressed in a bespoke suit of charcoal gray that radiated quiet, immense power. He looked to be in his early 50s, with a clean-shaven head and eyes that missed nothing. "Elijah Vance," he said, his voice smooth as velvet as he stepped into the room. "Lead investor at the Vanguard Group, and, as it happens, Kenna Tanaka's American business partner and the primary financier of Kenshin's expansion into the United States." Marcus, the manager, blinked rapidly, as if he'd been physically slapped. Alistair's face, which couldn't possibly get any paler, somehow did. Elijah Vance, the legendary, almost mythical investor. And his last name? Vance. He was Alistair's older brother, the successful one, the respected one. "I've been sitting at a table in the main dining room for the last 30 minutes, Elijah continued, his calm gaze sweeping over the wreckage of the meeting. "I was listening to a live feed of this entire conversation, including that enlightening recording." His eyes finally settled on Marcus, and they were as cold and hard as diamonds. "You will not be firing Ms. Williams tonight. In fact, if you value your job, you will be delivering a formal written apology to her before the end of the hour." Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a deck. No sound emerged. Elijah then turned his attention to Imani, and for the first time in her life, in a room full of powerful people, she felt seen. Not as a waitress, not as a prop, not as an inconvenience, but as the most valuable person in the room. "Young lady," he said, his voice softening with respect, "in a room full of sharks and sycophants, you were the only person who demonstrated a single shred of honor." Imani felt a lump form in her throat. The balance of power had just shifted again, this time with the force of an earthquake, not because of money or a title, but because one person had the courage to speak the truth, and another had the power to make the world stand still and listen. The chaos had subsided, replaced by a strange, supercharged calm. Marcus had all but vaporized, retreating from the room with his tail between his legs. Alistair and Julian sat like statues in a museum of failure, their arrogance completely stripped away, leaving behind only the pathetic, naked core of their greed. And Imani Williams stood at the center of the storm's quiet eye. Her apron was still neatly tied. Her posture was the same, but the universe around her had fundamentally realigned. She was no longer a waitress who had spoken out of turn. She was the architect of this new reality. Kana Tanaka rose from her chair and crossed the room, her movements fluid and deliberate. She stopped in front of Imani, her expression, for the first time all night, open and warm. She spoke in gentle, elegant Japanese, her words not a business proposition, but a heartfelt acknowledgement. Imani listened, her head bowed slightly, a tear she didn't know she'd been holding back finally tracing a path down her cheek. She composed herself, turned to Elijah, and gave him a quiet, summary translation. Elijah stepped forward, a genuine smile transforming his stern features. "Madame Tanaka has a proposition for you, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "She would like to formally offer you the newly created position of Chief Strategy Officer for Kenshin America." He paused, letting the words land. "This isn't a liaison role or an assistant position. You would be her right hand in the Western Hemisphere. You would oversee all international partnerships, build our corporate ethics and diversity framework from the ground up, and have a permanent seat on the global executive board." Imani felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was impossible. It was a dream. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a coronation. "Your entire student debt will be cleared tomorrow morning," Elijah continued, his voice steady. "We will fund any graduate or doctoral program you wish to pursue at any institution on Earth. A corporate apartment overlooking Central Park will be ready for you in New York by the end of the month. And your starting compensation package will reflect the fact that you just saved this company from a $2 billion mistake and, in the process, defined its future." Imani couldn't breathe. Her entire life, a story of being overlooked and undervalued, had just been rewritten in the span of an hour. Kana Tanaka stepped forward. She didn't offer a corporate handshake. Instead, she reached out and took both of Imani's hands in her own. Her grip was firm, her skin surprisingly soft. "You saw me," she said, her English soft but clear, imbued with a deep, resonant emotion. "When no one else in this room even looked." Imani finally found her voice, a whisper filled with the weight of the moment. "It would be the honor of my life." "Good," Kenna said, a true, brilliant smile lighting up her face. "Then our work begins now. We have a better world to build." She turned, and with Imani at her side, they walked out of the room, leaving the wreckage of the old world behind them without a single backward glance. The door that had always been slammed in Imani's face wasn't just open now. She had kicked it off its hinges and was walking through the frame to build a new one. The fallout was not a whisper. It was a sonic boom that echoed from Wall Street to Tokyo. Within 24 hours, the story, expertly leaked by Elijah Vance's team, was everywhere. There was no need for embellishment. The facts were damning enough. The recording of Alistair and Julian's conspiracy became the most downloaded file in the financial world. Omnicore's board of directors convened an emergency meeting that lasted all of 30 minutes. By the end of it, Alistair Vance was terminated, his resignation a transparent fiction. His golden parachute was voided by a morals clause he himself had insisted on including in his contract. Julian Croft was fired an hour later, escorted out of the building with his belongings in a cardboard box. The company's stock plummeted by 40% at the opening bell, a catastrophic loss of confidence from which it would likely never recover. The press was merciless. They didn't just report the story. They savored it. It was a modern-day fable of hubris and comeuppance. The Waitress and the Queen, how one act of courage toppled a corrupt CEO. From server to C-suite, the woman who blew up a billion-dollar deal. The narrative was irresistible. Two arrogant, powerful white men brought low by the two women they had dismissed as insignificant. An elderly Japanese relic and a nobody black waitress. The internet erupted, hailing Imani and Kenna as heroes. It was more than poetic justice. It was a cultural catharsis. For Alistair and Julian, the consequences were absolute. They became pariahs. Their names were toxic. Phone calls went unreturned. The exclusive clubs they belonged to suddenly reviewed their memberships. The world they had built their lives on, a world propped up by entitlement and casual cruelty, had turned on them completely. They had made the fatal mistake of believing their own hype, of thinking that some people simply didn't matter. They forgot that in today's world, the quietest voice, amplified by the truth, can become the loudest roar. Real power isn't always the person at the head of the table. Sometimes it's the person who's been listening from the shadows, the one who sees the things everyone else is too arrogant to notice. This was never just a story about a business deal gone wrong. It's a story about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. It's a story about the quiet dignity of those who refuse to be erased. Imani Williams was never just a waitress. She was a scholar, a cultural bridge, a woman of profound integrity who was forced to wear an apron to pay her bills. She carried a world of knowledge and experience within her that the men who judged her couldn't even begin to comprehend. She saw injustice, and she chose to act, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And Kenna Tanaka was a billionaire, yes, but in that room, she was also every woman who has ever been patronized, underestimated, and reduced to a lazy stereotype. Her true power wasn't in her bank account. It was in her unshakable composure, her strategic patience, and her wisdom to recognize a true ally not by their suit, but by their character. These two women, from two different worlds, were targeted by men who tried to use their perceived silence as a weapon against them. But in the end, they transformed that silence into a mirror, forcing the world to see the ugliness it reflected. The truth is, we are all guilty of this. We look at the person bagging our groceries, the janitor cleaning our office, the quiet intern in the corner, and we see the uniform, not the human being. We make assumptions, we categorize, we dismiss, we move on. But what if we stopped? What if we actually looked? What if we listened? So I'll ask you this. Who are the invisible people in your life? The ones whose names you don't know, whose stories you've never considered. Never, ever underestimate the quiet ones. You have no idea the wars they've fought, the knowledge they hold, or the power they wield. And if you are one of those quiet ones, if you've ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Your story matters. Your voice has weight. And your moment is coming. Maybe it won't be in a 50-story skyscraper for $1 billion deal, but it will come. And when it does, speak your truth. The world is desperate to hear it. This story started in a room of prejudice, but it ends with a lesson for all of us. If this resonated with you, if it made you think, then please share this video. Let this story ripple out. Let it be a reminder. And if you want to be a part of a community that believes in the power of these stories, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. We have so many more truths to tell. And we're just getting started.